In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where 1,000 civilizations had risen and fallen, where technologies beyond imagination shaped reality itself, there existed a universal truth that every species understood: some beings were born blessed, and others were born cursed. The galaxy had its hierarchies, its castes of power, and its unbreakable rules about who deserved salvation and who deserved only shadows. But what happens when the most despised creature in the known universe encounters the most feared? What occurs when a being cast out by every civilization meets a species that every empire has declared too dangerous to exist? Sometimes, in the darkest corners of space, where hope has been extinguished and mercy is just a forgotten word, the most unlikely partnerships are forged. This is the story of such an encounter. A story where the rejected find acceptance, where the condemned discover purpose, and where a single human proves that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply choosing to care when the rest of the universe has decided that caring is forbidden. The galaxy thought it knew everything about humans. They were wrong. And one outcast soul is about to discover just how wrong they were. Zara's claws scraped against the metal grating as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows of Nexus Station's lower levels. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the narrow maintenance corridor, each step a reminder of her precarious existence in the belly of the galaxy's most notorious trading hub. She held her breath, knowing that even the slightest movement could betray her presence to the galactic enforcement patrol that seemed to be growing more frequent with each passing cycle. The bioluminescent patches along her scaled arms dimmed instinctively, a survival mechanism her species had evolved over millennia of hiding from predators. But, here, in the supposedly civilized heart of galactic commerce, she wasn't hiding from ancient beasts or natural disasters. She was hiding from something far more dangerous: the judgment of an entire galaxy. As a Kythera, Zara belonged to what the Galactic Council had officially designated as a contaminated species. The label had been applied to her people 300 years ago, after the incident that had turned their homeworld into a quarantined wasteland. The Council's scientists had declared that Kythera carried within their genetic code the potential for catastrophic biological warfare, though no Kythera had ever willingly harmed another sentient being. The science behind the designation was questionable at best, but politics rarely concerned itself with truth. The footsteps passed by her hiding spot, and Zara finally allowed herself to exhale. She had been living in the station's forgotten corners for nearly 2 months now, surviving on scraps and the occasional act of kindness from other outcasts who understood what it meant to be unwanted. The irony wasn't lost on her that Nexus Station, a place where supposedly anyone could find their fortune among the stars, had become just another prison for those the galaxy had decided to discard. She emerged from her hiding place and began making her way toward the abandoned cargo bay where she had made her temporary home. The walls around her told the story of Nexus Station's forgotten depths through layers of rust and graffiti in dozens of languages. Some of the writing was political, calling for the overthrow of the Galactic Council. Other markings were more personal, the desperate scratches of beings who had found themselves trapped between the stars with nowhere left to go. Zara's webbed feet made almost no sound as she navigated the familiar path through twisted corridors and broken ventilation shafts. She had learned every hidden route, every blind spot in the station's security network, and every place where someone like her could exist without drawing unwanted attention. It was a skill that had kept her alive, but it was also a constant reminder of how far she had fallen from the dreams that had brought her to this place. She had come to Nexus Station with hope. Despite everything her people had endured, despite the countless rejections and the legal barriers that prevented Kythera from holding legitimate employment anywhere in Council space, she had believed that somehow she could build a different life. Her expertise in xenobiology had earned her advanced degrees from underground universities, and her research into cross-species disease prevention had shown promise for helping the galaxy's more vulnerable populations. But hope, Zara had learned, was a luxury that contaminated species couldn't afford. The cargo bay that served as her home was exactly as she had left it, a collection of discarded shipping containers arranged to provide shelter and privacy. She had spent weeks building this space into something livable, using her engineering skills to tap into the station's power grid without triggering security systems. It wasn't much, but it was hers. As she settled into her makeshift laboratory, constructed from salvaged equipment and black market components, Zara tried to push away the familiar weight of despair that threatened to crush her each day. She had been working on a project that could revolutionize medicine for dozens of species, but, without access to proper resources or official channels for publication, her research remained trapped in the same shadows that concealed her existence. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. Kithara were naturally social creatures, evolved from herd animals that had thrived through cooperation and mutual support. Being alone went against every instinct in her body, creating a psychological pressure that sometimes felt worse than the physical deprivation of her current circumstances. She had tried to reach out to other outcasts on the station, but trust was a rare commodity in places like this, and her species' reputation made even the desperate wary of association. She was examining a sample of engineered bacteria under her improvised microscope when the explosion shook the entire section of the station. The lights flickered and went out completely, leaving only the faint emergency illumination that cast everything in an eerie red glow. Somewhere in the distance, alarms began to wail, and the sound of running footsteps echoed through the corridors as station personnel responded to whatever crisis had erupted. Zara's first instinct was to hide deeper in her sanctuary, but curiosity got the better of her. She had seen explosions before, usually the result of gang warfare or industrial accidents in the station's more dangerous sectors. But this felt different. The blast had been too controlled, too precise to be an accident, and the pattern of the alarms suggested that something much more serious than a simple accident had occurred. She made her way carefully toward the source of the disturbance, using her knowledge of the station's layout to avoid the main corridors where security forces would be rushing to respond. As she climbed through a series of maintenance shafts that led toward the mid-levels, she could hear the chatter of emergency communications echoing through the walls. The words she caught were fragmented but alarming: containment breach, unauthorized landing, and, most ominously, human contact protocol. The last phrase made her freeze in place. Humans were legendary in this part of the galaxy, though not in any positive sense. They were the bogeymen that parents used to frighten children into obedience, the cautionary tale that diplomats invoked when discussing the dangers of unchecked aggression. According to the official histories, humans were a species so violent and unpredictable that they had been quarantined to their home system by joint action of every major galactic power. That quarantine had been in place for over a century, and, in all that time, no human had been seen in Council space. If one was here now, on Nexus Station, it could only mean that something had gone terribly wrong with the containment measures that were supposed to keep them isolated from civilized space. Zara reached an observation port that looked out onto one of the station's main docking bays, and what she saw there made her question everything she thought she knew about humans. The bay was filled with smoke and debris from what appeared to be an emergency landing. Station security forces had formed a perimeter around a strange, angular ship that looked like nothing she had ever seen before. The vessel's design was aggressive and alien, with weapon systems that seemed built for war rather than exploration. But it was the figure emerging from the ship that captured her attention completely. The human was smaller than she had expected based on the fearsome reputation of their species. They moved with a careful, almost cautious gait that seemed at odds with the stories of human violence and aggression. Most surprising of all, they appeared to be injured, favoring their left side as they slowly descended the ship's ramp with hands raised in what any species would recognize as a gesture of surrender. The station's security forces were clearly unprepared for this situation. Zara could see the confusion and fear in their posture as they maintained their weapons trained on the lone human. She could hear fragments of heated communication as various officers tried to determine what protocols should govern this unprecedented situation. Nobody seemed to know whether they should treat this as a first contact scenario, a containment situation, or an act of war. What struck Zara most about the scene was how isolated the human appeared. They stood alone in the center of a ring of armed beings, clearly injured and far from anything that could be considered home, yet they maintained a dignity that reminded her of her own determination to survive in hostile circumstances. There was something in the human's posture that spoke to her understanding of what it meant to be unwanted and feared through no fault of your own. As she watched, one of the security officers stepped forward and began speaking into a translation device. Even from her distant observation point, Zara could see that the human was responding, though the conversation appeared to be going poorly. The universal translator was clearly struggling with human language patterns, and frustration was beginning to show on both sides of the exchange. Then, something happened that changed everything. One of the younger security officers, perhaps overcome by fear or prejudice, fired his weapon. The energy blast struck the human in the shoulder, spinning them around and dropping them to their knees. The reaction from the other security personnel was immediate and chaotic. with some shouting orders to cease fire while others raised their own weapons in preparation for retaliation. But the humans' response was not what any of them expected. Instead of fighting back or retreating, they slowly raised their hands again, this time while bleeding from what was clearly a significant wound. They spoke again, and, while the translation was still garbled, there was something in their tone that cut through the technological barriers. It was not the voice of a conqueror or a monster. It was the voice of someone asking for help. Zara found herself moving before she had consciously decided to act. Her scientific training had taught her to observe and analyze rather than intervene, but something about the scene below compelled her to abandon caution. She had spent her entire life being judged and condemned based on the fears and prejudices of others, and she couldn't stand by and watch the same thing happen to another being, even one whose species was supposed to be her natural enemy. She began making her way down through the station's infrastructure toward the docking bay, using her knowledge of the maintenance systems to bypass the security cordons that had been established around the area. It was dangerous and probably foolish, but she had lived with danger for so long that it had become just another aspect of her daily existence. As she moved through the shadows beneath the docking bay, she could hear the argument above growing more heated. Station administrators had arrived and were debating whether to contact the Galactic Council immediately or attempt to handle the situation themselves. Some voices advocated for immediate execution of the human as a preemptive measure, while others argued for restraint until proper authorities could be consulted. The human, meanwhile, had managed to stop the bleeding from their wound using what appeared to be an emergency medical kit from their ship. They sat cross-legged on the deck, still surrounded by weapons but no longer appearing as an immediate threat to anyone. There was something almost meditative about their posture, as if they had accepted whatever fate awaited them. Zara reached a maintenance hatch that would allow her to enter the docking bay behind a stack of cargo containers. From this position, she would be close enough to the human to potentially make contact without immediately alerting the security forces. She wasn't sure what she intended to do, but every instinct in her body was telling her that this being needed help, and helping others was something her people had always done, regardless of the personal cost. She carefully opened the hatch and slipped into the bay, using the cargo containers as cover while she observed the situation from a much closer perspective. The human was even more fascinating up close. Their skin was a pale color that seemed almost luminescent under the bay's harsh lighting, and their hair was a shade of brown that shifted between different tones as they moved. But it was their eyes that captured her attention most completely. They were a deep blue color that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and emotion that contradicted everything she had been taught about their species. As she watched, the humans suddenly turned their head in her direction, as if they had somehow sensed her presence despite her careful concealment. For a moment, their eyes met across the space between them, and Zara felt a shock of recognition that had nothing to do with species or politics or the fears that governed galactic civilization. She saw, reflected in those human eyes, the same desperate hope that she carried in her own heart. The same refusal to surrender despite overwhelming odds. The same stubborn insistence on dignity in the face of a universe that seemed determined to crush anyone who didn't fit its narrow definitions of acceptable existence. The human's lips moved, forming words too quiet for the translation devices to pick up, but Zara didn't need technology to understand what they were saying. She had spoken those same words herself, in the darkest moments of her exile, when the weight of isolation threatened to break her spirit completely. They were asking for someone, anyone, to see them as more than the monster that others believed them to be. They were asking for a chance to prove that the fears and prejudices that defined their existence might be wrong. They were asking for salvation from a universe that had already decided they didn't deserve it. And, in that moment, Zara realized that she might be the only being in the galaxy positioned to provide the answer they were seeking. The decision formed in Zara's mind like crystallizing ice, sharp and clear and irrevocable. She had spent her entire adult life studying the intersection between species, learning how different forms of life could coexist and support each other despite biological and cultural barriers. Now, faced with a being who was as rejected and feared as she was, all of that academic knowledge transformed into something much more personal and immediate. She began moving carefully along the edge of the cargo containers, using her natural camouflage abilities to blend with the shadows while she planned her approach. The security forces were still engaged in heated debate about proper protocol, giving her a window of opportunity that might not come again. The human remained seated in the center of their armed circle, occasionally touching their wounded shoulder but otherwise maintaining the same calm, almost resigned posture that had struck her so powerfully. Zara's species had evolved sophisticated methods of nonverbal communication, using subtle changes in bioluminescence and body positioning to convey complex emotional states. As she watched the human, she began to recognize similar patterns in their behavior. The slight tension in their shoulders spoke of pain being carefully controlled. The way they held their head suggested someone listening intently to conversations they couldn't fully understand. Most telling of all was the periodic scanning of their surroundings, not with the paranoid alertness of a predator, but with the careful awareness of someone trying to assess potential threats and allies. She had reached a position directly behind the human when one of the station administrators made a decision that changed everything. The Calvarian official, whose species was known for their rigid adherence to bureaucratic procedures, announced that they had received communication from the Galactic Council regarding the human situation. The message was brief and unambiguous: the human was to be contained immediately and transported to a secure facility for study and eventual disposal. The reaction among the security forces was mixed. Some seemed relieved to have clear direction, while others appeared uncomfortable with what amounted to an execution order disguised as administrative procedure. The human, despite the translation difficulties, seemed to understand enough to know that their situation had just become much more dire. Zara watched as the human's posture shifted subtly, becoming more alert and focused. Their hands remained visible and non-threatening, but she could see them calculating angles and distances, preparing for what might be their last chance at survival. It was a transformation that reminded her of her own people's ancient instincts, the way a peaceful herd animal could become dangerous when cornered with no other options. She had to act now, before the situation escalated beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. Drawing on techniques her people had developed for approaching other species in the wild, she began generating a specific pattern of bioluminescence that served as a universal signal of non-aggressive intent. The light was subtle enough that the security forces, focused on their primary target, were unlikely to notice it immediately. The human, however, turned toward her almost immediately. Their eyes widened in surprise, but they had the presence of mind to keep their reaction controlled enough not to alert the surrounding guards. Zara could see intelligence working behind those blue eyes as the human tried to process this new development and determine whether it represented opportunity or additional threat. She began moving slowly into the open, maintaining the non-aggressive light pattern while keeping her hands clearly visible. Her heart was racing with a combination of terror and excitement that made her feel more alive than she had in months. She was about to commit an act that would either save 2 lives or doom them both, and there was no way to predict which outcome was more likely. The first security officer to notice her approach shouted in alarm, swinging his weapon in her direction. The sudden movement caused a ripple of tension throughout the assembled forces, and, for a moment it seemed as though the situation might explode into violence. But, the station administrator who had delivered the council's orders held up a hand, apparently more curious than threatened by this unexpected development. "Identify yourself," the administrator demanded, activating a translation device that would allow communication with most species in council space. Zara continued her careful approach, keeping her movements slow and deliberate while she considered how to respond. The truth about her species would likely make the situation worse, but lies would be detected quickly by the sophisticated scanning equipment that was standard on stations like this. "I am Zara of the Kithara," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "I am a xenobiologist, and I believe this being requires medical attention." The admission of her species' identity caused an immediate stir among the assembled security forces. Several weapons swung in her direction as officers recognized the name of a contaminated species. The station administrator's expression shifted from curiosity to alarm, and she could see him accessing his personal database to confirm what he undoubtedly hoped was some kind of mistake. "A contaminated species and quarantined human," one of the security officers said, his voice thick with disgust. "This station is becoming a collection point for galactic refuse." The word stung, but Zara had heard similar sentiments countless times before. What surprised her was the human's reaction to the exchange. Despite the translation difficulties, they seemed to understand enough to recognize that she was being insulted, and their expression shifted to something that looked unmistakably like anger on her behalf. "Why are you here?" the administrator asked, his tone suggesting that her answer would determine whether she joined the human as a prisoner or was simply ordered to leave. Zara looked directly at the human as she responded, wanting them to understand her words even if the translation technology failed to convey their full meaning. Because this being is injured and alone, and every sentient creature deserves basic medical care and dignity regardless of their species or the political circumstances of their presence here. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of her entire worldview. She had built her life around the principle that science and compassion could transcend the artificial barriers that politics created between different forms of life. Now she was putting that principle to its ultimate test. The human spoke then, directing their words toward the translation device but keeping their eyes on Zara. The technology struggled with their language patterns, but enough came through to convey the basic meaning. She's right. I need help, and I'm not here to hurt anyone. The administrator looked between them with an expression that suggested he was beginning to realize that this situation had moved far beyond standard protocols. The council's orders were specific. The human is to be contained and transported immediately. The council's orders said nothing about a Kithara xenobiologist, Zara replied, surprised by her own boldness. I formally request the right to provide emergency medical assistance as guaranteed under Article 15 of the Galactic Medical Convention. It was a legal longshot, but the convention was one of the few pieces of galactic law that superseded species-based discrimination. Every member world of the council had signed the treaty, agreeing that basic medical care could not be denied based on political considerations. The fact that both she and the human were from restricted species created a legal gray area that might provide enough confusion to buy them some time. The administrator's hesitation told her that her gambit had at least partially succeeded. He was clearly trying to determine whether the medical convention applied to contaminated species and quarantined humans, and that uncertainty was creating the delay she needed. She used the moment of confusion to move closer to the human, pulling her improvised medical kit from her pack as she approached. The human watched her carefully, but when she knelt beside them and began examining their wounded shoulder, they didn't resist. Up close, she could see that the injury was worse than it had initially appeared. The energy weapon had created a burn that was both deep and infected with some kind of technological residue that was preventing natural healing. This is going to need immediate treatment, she said loudly enough for the surrounding officers to hear. The wound is infected with smart particle residue from the energy weapon. Without proper care, it could become systemic within hours. It was partially true, though she was exaggerating the timeline for dramatic effect. Smart particle contamination was a recognized medical emergency that required specialized treatment. By framing the situation as a medical crisis rather than a political problem, she was hoping to shift the entire context of their encounter. The human seemed to understand what she was doing and played along, grimacing in apparent pain as she examined their wound. It's getting worse, they said, their words coming through the translation device with better clarity now that the system had more time to analyze their speech patterns. Please, I just need help. The combination of medical emergency and direct plea for assistance created exactly the kind of ethical complexity that bureaucrats preferred to avoid. Zara could see the administrator weighing his options, trying to find a path that would satisfy the council's orders while avoiding responsibility for any negative consequences that might arise from denying emergency medical care. You have 30 minutes, he finally announced. Treat the wound under guard, then both of you will be transferred to holding cells pending further instructions. It wasn't freedom, but it was opportunity. Zara began working on the human's injury while her mind raced through possibilities for what might happen next. 30 minutes wasn't enough time to plan an escape or develop a comprehensive strategy, but it might be enough to establish the foundation for something more substantial. As she cleaned the wound and applied biological cleansing agents from her kit, the human spoke to her quietly. The translation device was having trouble with their lowered voice, creating an opportunity for more private communication. I'm Marcus, they said, their words barely audible above the ambient noise of the docking bay. Zara, she replied, using her own language rather than the standard galactic tongue. Do you understand what's happening here? Marcus nodded slightly, wincing as she worked on his shoulder. Enough. I'm guessing you're not exactly welcome here either. Despite the gravity of their situation, Zara felt a small smile touch her lips. That's an understatement. My people are considered contaminated. Yours are quarantined. We're both supposed to be too dangerous for civilized society. How's that working out for us? Marcus asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested humor despite their circumstances. Not particularly well, from where I'm sitting, Zara admitted. But maybe that gives us something to work with. She had finished the preliminary treatment of his wound and was applying a temporary bandage when Marcus asked the question she had been dreading. Why are you helping me? You don't know anything about me or why I'm here. It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. Zara continued working while she considered how to explain something that she wasn't entirely sure she understood herself. Because, she said finally, I've spent my entire life being judged for things I never did and condemned for dangers I don't represent. I've been rejected by every institution, denied every opportunity, and treated as a threat by people who've never bothered to learn anything true about me or my species. And when I saw you sitting here, surrounded by weapons and fear, asking for help that no one wanted to give you, I recognized something. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of understanding that transcended species barriers. You recognized another outcast. I recognized another person who deserves a chance to prove that the universe might be wrong about them, Zara corrected. Whether or not you turn out to be everything they fear is less important to me than whether you get the opportunity to show them who you really are. The administrator was approaching, indicating that their brief respite was coming to an end. Security forces were already moving to escort them to whatever holding facilities had been prepared for this unprecedented situation. But, in the few minutes they had worked together, something had changed between Zara and Marcus that went beyond simple medical treatment. They had recognized each other as fellow exiles, beings cast out by a galaxy that preferred fear to understanding. More importantly, they had discovered that even in the most desperate circumstances, it was possible to find someone willing to take a chance on hope rather than surrender to the certainty of despair. As the security forces surrounded them, Zara caught Marcus looking at her with an expression that confirmed her own growing conviction. They were no longer alone. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, and that simple fact transformed their situation from hopeless isolation to something approaching possibility. The administrator gestured for them to stand, and, as they complied with the order, Marcus spoke quietly enough that only Zara could hear. Thank you, he said, for seeing me as something other than a monster. Thank you, she replied, for giving me something to fight for again. They were led away from the docking bay toward whatever uncertain fate awaited them, but neither felt the despair that had defined their recent existence. They had found each other in the darkness between the stars, and that discovery had rekindled something that both had thought was lost forever, the belief that maybe, against all odds and expectations, they might actually have a chance to build something better than the life of exile that had seemed to be their only option. The holding cells in Nexus Station's lower detention levels were designed to contain the galaxy's most dangerous criminals, equipped with energy barriers that could adapt to virtually any known species' physiology. Zara found herself in a sterile chamber whose walls hummed with suppression fields intended to prevent her from using any potential biological weapons her species might possess. The irony that such weapons existed only in the imagination of fearful politicians was lost on the security systems. Marcus occupied the cell adjacent to hers, separated by a transparent aluminum barrier that allowed them to see and speak to each other while maintaining physical isolation. His wound had been properly treated by the station's medical staff, though the attending physician had worked with obvious reluctance and minimal interaction. The smart particle contamination had been neutralized, but the injury would require several more days to heal completely. They had been imprisoned for 18 hours when Administrator Vex arrived with a datapad full of official communications and an expression that suggested their situation had become even more complicated. The Calvarian's rigid posture and carefully controlled movements indicated someone dealing with pressure from multiple sources, none of which were likely to be sympathetic to their current prisoners. The Galactic Council has responded to our report, Vex announced, his tone carrying the weight of bureaucratic finality. Transport arrangements are being made to deliver both of you to separate facilities for extended evaluation and containment. Zara felt her heart sink at the word separate. She had known that their temporary alliance was fragile, but she had hoped for more time to explore the possibilities that their partnership might represent. Marcus's expression suggested similar disappointment, though he maintained the calm demeanor that seemed to be his default response to crisis. Extended evaluation, Marcus repeated, his words coming through the translation system with bitter clarity. That's an interesting way to describe indefinite imprisonment. The Council's xenobiologists are particularly interested in studying the interaction patterns between contaminated and quarantined species, Vex continued, apparently oblivious to the implications of his words. Your willingness to provide medical assistance despite significant risk represents an anomaly that requires further investigation. The casual reduction of their connection to a research curiosity sparked anger in Zara that surprised her with its intensity. She had spent her life being treated as a specimen rather than a person, but somehow having the same dismissive attitude applied to Marcus felt like a more personal insult. We're not anomalies, she said, her voice carrying more edge than she had intended. We're individuals making choices based on our own values and experiences. The fact that those choices don't fit your models says more about the limitations of your understanding than it does about us. Vex's expression suggested that he found her response both unexpected and mildly interesting. Your xenobiological training is noted in your file. Perhaps you can explain why a member of a species known for extreme self-preservation instincts would risk exposure to assist an individual from a species classified as maximally dangerous. It was exactly the kind of question that reduced complex emotions and moral decisions to simplistic biological determinism. Zara had encountered similar thinking throughout her academic career, and she had learned that the best response was often to challenge the underlying assumptions rather than accept the framing of the question. Perhaps, she said carefully, the classifications you're referring to are based on incomplete information and political considerations rather than accurate assessment of actual behavior patterns. The suggestion that official council classifications might be flawed was clearly not something Vex was prepared to engage with directly. He made a note on his datapad and shifted his attention to Marcus. The transport for the human will arrive first, he announced. Council security forces are still en route, but they should be here within 6 hours. The contaminated specimen will be transferred separately once proper containment protocols have been established. Marcus stood up slowly, his movement careful due to his healing injury. Before you ship us off to whatever laboratories you have planned, I think there's something you should know about why I'm here. Vex paused in his data entry, apparently curious despite his obvious desire to treat the entire situation as a routine administrative matter. Quarantine species are not permitted to communicate intelligence regarding their activities beyond the isolation zone. I'm not trying to communicate intelligence, Marcus replied. I'm trying to prevent a catastrophe that's going to affect everyone in this part of the galaxy, including the people on this station. The claim was dramatic enough to capture Vex's attention completely. He set down his datapad and activated recording equipment, clearly recognizing that this conversation might have significance beyond routine prisoner processing. Explain, he said simply. Marcus looked at Zara before responding, and she could see him making a decision about how much to reveal and how to frame information that might be their only chance to change their circumstances. 3 weeks ago, our long-range sensors detected massive gravitational anomalies in the Kepler 442 system, Marcus began. The pattern matched theoretical models for artificial singularity collapse, the kind of thing that happens when someone tries to build a wormhole generator without proper stabilization technology. Zara felt her scientific mind immediately engage with the implications of what Marcus was describing. Artificial singularity research was one of the most dangerous fields in theoretical physics, banned by virtually every galactic government precisely because the consequences of failure were so catastrophic. That system was evacuated and sealed 50 years ago after industrial contamination made it uninhabitable, Vex said, his tone suggesting skepticism about Marcus's claims. Officially, yes, Marcus agreed. But someone has been using it as a research facility for banned weapons development. Our analysis suggests that whoever was conducting the research lost control of their experiments, and the gravitational distortions are expanding at an exponential rate. Vex was clearly struggling to process this information within his existing framework for understanding the situation. Even if what you're saying is true, humans are quarantined specifically because of their tendency toward military aggression. Why should anyone trust your analysis of weapons research? It was Marcus's turn to look frustrated with the limitations of official thinking. Because we've been dealing with the consequences of weapons research longer than most species have had interstellar flight. We know what these signatures look like because we've seen what happens when experiments like this go wrong. Zara found herself leaning forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her awareness of their precarious situation. What kind of timeline are we looking at for the expansion? Marcus turned to her with obvious relief that someone was engaging with the technical aspects of his warning rather than dismissing it based on political considerations. Based on our calculations, the distortion field will reach critical mass within 72 hours. Once that happens, it'll start pulling matter out of normal spacetime in an expanding sphere that could potentially affect everything within a 15 light-year radius. The number made Zara's breath catch in her throat. Nexus Station was well within that radius, along with dozens of inhabited systems and billions of sentient lives. If Marcus was correct about the timeline, they were looking at a disaster that would make historical catastrophes seem insignificant by comparison. You're claiming that this station is in immediate danger from an expanding gravitational anomaly, Vex said, his bureaucratic training apparently struggling to find appropriate protocols for this situation. I'm not claiming anything, Marcus replied. I'm stating facts based on sensor data and mathematical analysis. The question is whether you're willing to risk billions of lives because you'd rather follow quarantine protocols than investigate a credible threat. Vex was quiet for several minutes, clearly trying to determine how to handle information that could be either the most important intelligence he had ever received or an elaborate deception designed to manipulate official responses. Finally, he spoke with the careful tone of someone making a decision that could define his entire career. Assuming for the moment that your analysis is correct, what would you propose as a response to this threat? Marcus exchanged another look with Zara before answering, and she realized that this moment represented a crucial decision point for both of them. They could continue to be passive victims of circumstances beyond their control, or they could try to take an active role in shaping their fate. The expansion can be stopped, Marcus said, but it requires a coordinated response using technology that most species don't possess independently. Humans have experience with gravitational manipulation because we've had to deal with the aftermath of our own failed experiments. Kythera have biological technologies that can interface with quantum-level processes in ways that mechanical systems can't replicate. Zara felt her heart race as she realized what Marcus was suggesting. You're talking about a joint operation using both human and Kythera expertise. I'm talking about using the best available resources to prevent a catastrophe, regardless of the political complications that might create, Marcus confirmed. The alternative is to let billions of people die because the galaxy's leadership is more concerned with maintaining quarantine protocols than with solving problems. The suggestion that contaminated and quarantined species might be necessary to prevent a galactic disaster was clearly not something that Vex's training had prepared him to handle. He stood motionless for several minutes, apparently trying to process the implications of what he was hearing. Even if what you're saying is true, he finally said, I don't have the authority to authorize the kind of operation you're describing. The Council would need to approve any response, and that approval would need to come through official channels with proper verification of your claims. How long would that process take? Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Minimum of 2 weeks for emergency authorization, assuming the Council agrees to expedite the review process, Vex admitted. Marcus shook his head slowly. We don't have 2 weeks. We have less than 3 days, and most of that time would need to be spent on preparation and travel to the affected system. The timeline created exactly the kind of impossible situation that bureaucratic systems were particularly bad at handling. The potential consequences of action were enormous, but the potential consequences of inaction were literally catastrophic. For someone like Vex, who had built his career on following established procedures, the choice between personal risk and systemic destruction represented an ethical crisis that had no clear resolution. There might be another option, Zara said slowly, an idea forming as she considered their limited options. What if we could provide independent verification of the threat analysis? If the data could be confirmed through sources that the Council considers reliable, it might expedite the authorization process. Marcus looked at her with growing interest. What did you have in mind? My research into cross-species disease prevention required extensive collaboration with xenobiologists from dozens of different systems. I have contacts throughout the academic community who could analyze the gravitational data independently and provide verification through official channels. It was a long shot, but it represented the kind of scientific approach to problem solving that might bypass some of the political obstacles they were facing. If they could build a consensus among respected researchers from multiple species, it might create enough pressure to force official action despite the political complications. Vex was clearly intrigued by the possibility, but also uncertain about the procedural implications. You're talking about sharing classified sensor data with unauthorized personnel for the purpose of influencing council policy. I'm talking about saving lives using the fastest available method, Zara corrected. The question is whether you're willing to take responsibility for preventing a catastrophe or whether you'd prefer to follow procedures while billions of people die. It was a harsh framing, but their situation called for clarity rather than diplomatic subtlety. Vex needed to understand that this was a moment when normal rules might not be sufficient to address extraordinary circumstances. As they waited for his response, Zara felt something shifting in her understanding of her own situation and possibilities. For months, she had defined herself primarily as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, someone whose life had been shaped by the prejudices and fears of others. But this crisis was creating an opportunity to reclaim agency and purpose, to use her skills and knowledge to make a difference on a scale she had never imagined possible. More importantly, she was no longer facing that opportunity alone. Marcus represented not just an ally, but a partner whose skills and experience complemented her own in ways that might make the impossible seem achievable. Together, they might be able to accomplish something that neither could manage independently. And that realization was transforming her understanding of what their partnership might represent. The galaxy had tried to keep them separated and powerless, treating them as individual threats to be contained rather than recognizing their potential value as partners in solving complex problems. But circumstances had brought them together despite official efforts to prevent such cooperation, and now they had the chance to prove that the universe's fears about their species might be less important than its need for their unique abilities. Administrator Vex's decision came faster than either Zara or Marcus had expected. Within an hour of their conversation about the gravitational anomaly, he had returned with a security escort and an expression that suggested he had made peace with whatever consequences his actions might bring. "I'm implementing emergency protocols under Section 7 of the Station Emergency Management Code," he announced, his words carrying the weight of someone who had chosen principle over procedure. "This gives me temporary authority to authorize unusual responses to imminent threats without waiting for council approval." Zara felt a surge of hope that was immediately tempered by caution. Emergency protocols were notoriously limited in scope, and she doubted they provided authority for the kind of unprecedented cooperation that would be necessary to address the crisis Marcus had described. "What exactly does that mean for us?" Marcus asked, apparently sharing her skepticism about how far emergency powers could stretch. "It means," Vex said carefully, "that I can authorize the temporary release of prisoners for the purpose of consulting on emergency response planning. The authorization is limited to this station and expires in 72 hours, but it does provide some legal framework for what we're about to attempt." The time frame was exactly what they needed, assuming Marcus's calculations about the gravitational anomaly were correct. More importantly, temporary release would give them access to communication systems and technical resources that might make the difference between success and failure. "There are conditions," Vex continued. "Both of you will be accompanied by security escorts at all times. All communications will be monitored and recorded. And if my superiors decide that I exceeded my authority, we'll all face consequences that could include permanent imprisonment or worse." It was hardly ideal, but it was more opportunity than either of them had possessed an hour earlier. Zara looked at Marcus and saw her own determination reflected in his expression. They had been given a chance to act rather than simply react, and that chance might be the only one they would get. "We accept your conditions," Marcus said. "But we'll need access to your long-range communication array and permission to contact researchers who can provide independent verification of the threat analysis." "Already arranged," Vex replied. "I've reserved time on the primary communications system, and I prepared authorization codes that should allow your contacts to access the relevant data through encrypted channels." The speed and thoroughness of his preparations suggested that Vex had been planning this course of action even while maintaining his bureaucratic skepticism. Zara realized that beneath his rigid exterior, the Calvarian administrator possessed the same capacity for moral courage that had motivated her own decision to help Marcus. They were escorted from the detention center to one of the station's secure conference rooms, equipped with communication equipment that represented the cutting edge of galactic technology. The transition from prisoners to consultants felt surreal, but Zara forced herself to focus on the technical challenges ahead rather than dwelling on the political implications of what they were attempting. Marcus immediately began uploading his sensor data to the communication array, while Zara started composing messages to her academic contacts. The gravitational readings were even more alarming when displayed on high-resolution equipment. The patterns showed not just exponential expansion, but signs of dimensional instability that could produce effects far beyond simple gravitational distortion. "This is worse than I initially calculated," Marcus admitted as he reviewed the enhanced data. "The interaction between artificial singularities and natural spacetime curvature is creating resonance effects that could propagate through subspace. We're not just looking at localized destruction, but potential damage to the fundamental structure of reality in this region of the galaxy." The revelation added new urgency to their efforts, but it also made their task seem impossibly daunting. They weren't just trying to prevent a disaster, they were trying to preserve the basic stability of spacetime itself. Zara's first responses from her contacts began arriving within minutes of her initial messages. Dr. Thane Corvus, a Altarian physicist whose work on quantum mechanics had earned galactic recognition, confirmed that the gravitational signatures were consistent with cascade failure in artificial singularity research. Dr. Lyra Nas, a Centaurian expert in dimensional stability, provided mathematical models that supported Marcus's timeline projections. But it was the response from Dr. Kamal Azair, a human xenobiologist working under deep cover in Council space, that provided the most crucial information. His message was brief but devastating. Kythera biological quantum interface technology is the only known method for stabilizing dimensional resonance at the scales you're describing. Without it, any attempt to stop the expansion will fail catastrophically. The confirmation that both human and Kythera expertise would be absolutely necessary created a political problem that went far beyond emergency protocols. The operation they were contemplating would require not just cooperation between quarantined and contaminated species, but official council authorization for activities that violated fundamental policies about interspecies contact. "We need to present this to the council as a unified analysis from respected researchers across multiple species," Zara said as more confirmatory responses arrived. "If we can demonstrate scientific consensus about both the threat and the solution, it becomes harder for political considerations to override objective necessity." Marcus nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Even if we get authorization, we'll need access to specialized equipment and resources that don't officially exist. Human gravitational manipulation technology has been classified as forbidden research for over a century. Kythera biological interface systems are considered contaminated by definition." It was the kind of circular problem that bureaucratic systems created when they prioritized control over effectiveness. The tools they needed to solve the crisis were forbidden precisely because they were effective, and the crisis existed because those same tools had been developed in secret by people who couldn't obtain legitimate access to proper safety protocols. Vex, who had been monitoring their progress while managing his own communications with higher authorities, approached with news that confirmed their worst suspicions about the political obstacles they would face. "I've reported our preliminary findings to the Council Emergency Response Committee," he said. Their initial reaction is skepticism about both the threat analysis and the proposed solution. They're particularly resistant to any plan that involves cooperation between quarantined and contaminated species. "What would it take to convince them?" Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Independent confirmation from council-approved researchers, detailed technical specifications for any proposed intervention, and absolute guarantees that the operation won't create additional threats to galactic security," Vex replied. The requirements were simultaneously reasonable and impossible to fulfill within their available timeframe. Independent confirmation would take weeks to arrange through official channels. Technical specifications for classified research couldn't be provided without violating security protocols. And absolute guarantees about complex operations involving experimental technology were impossible under any circumstances. "They're asking for certainty about an inherently uncertain situation," Marcus observed. It's the kind of demand that bureaucrats make when they want to avoid responsibility for difficult decisions. Zara felt frustration building as she contemplated the gap between what was necessary and what was politically feasible. They had the knowledge and expertise to address the crisis, but the same institutional structures that had created their exile were preventing them from applying their abilities to save lives. Maybe, she said slowly, we're approaching this from the wrong direction. Marcus looked at her with curious attention. What do you mean? We're trying to work within a system that has already decided we're too dangerous to trust, Zara explained. But the system itself is what created this crisis by driving research underground and preventing proper cooperation between species with complementary abilities. The observation was accurate but didn't immediately suggest an alternative approach. They were still bound by the same political and legal constraints that had shaped their entire adult lives. Unless, Marcus said, his voice carrying the tone of someone working through a dangerous idea, we stop asking for permission and start taking responsibility for our own actions. It was exactly what Zara had been thinking but hadn't quite been ready to voice. The suggestion that they might act independently of official authorization was both terrifying and liberating. You're talking about operating outside council authority, Vex said, his bureaucratic instincts clearly alarmed by the direction of their conversation. I'm talking about saving billions of lives when the official response is inadequate to address the scale of the crisis, Marcus replied. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the illegal thing to do. Zara found herself nodding in agreement despite her awareness of the enormous risks involved. We have the knowledge, the contacts, and the motivation. The only thing we don't have is official permission, and waiting for that permission guarantees failure. It was a moment of decision that would define not just their immediate future, but their entire understanding of their place in a galaxy that had rejected them. They could continue to be victims of circumstances beyond their control, or they could choose to become agents of change even if that choice came with enormous personal cost. My ship has the navigational equipment necessary to reach the affected system, Marcus said, his words carrying the weight of commitment. And it's designed to operate independently without external support systems. I have access to biological interface technology through my research network, Zara added. It's not officially sanctioned, but it represents the most advanced work in the field. Vex looked between them with an expression that suggested he was watching his entire career disappear in real time. You're talking about stealing a ship, absconding with classified technology, and conducting unauthorized operations in a restricted system. We're talking about preventing a catastrophe that will kill billions of people, Zara corrected. Everything else is just politics. The administrator was quiet for several minutes, apparently weighing his own values against his professional obligations. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a resignation that suggested he had found his own moment of moral clarity. I can delay reporting your location for approximately 6 hours, he said carefully. After that, I'll be required to inform Council security that you've escaped custody during a prisoner transfer. It was as close to official assistance as they could hope for under the circumstances, and it represented a personal sacrifice that Vex was making for the sake of lives he would never know. The gesture reminded Zara that even within systems that seemed designed to prevent moral action, individuals could still choose to do the right thing when circumstances demanded it. Thank you, Marcus said simply, for giving us the chance to try. Thank you, Zara added, for proving that bureaucrats can have courage when it matters. As they began making preparations for what might be the most important and dangerous mission of their lives, Zara felt something fundamental shifting in her understanding of herself and her place in the galaxy. For the first time since her exile had begun, she was choosing her own path rather than simply surviving the consequences of others' decisions. More importantly, she was no longer alone in that choice. Marcus had become not just an ally, but a true partner whose commitment to doing the right thing matched her own. Together, they were about to attempt something that the galaxy's most powerful institutions had declared impossible: cooperation between species that were supposed to be natural enemies, working together to save a civilization that had rejected them both. It was exactly the kind of impossible thing that Zara had always believed science could accomplish, if only people were willing to look beyond their fears and prejudices long enough to recognize the potential that lay hidden in the spaces between different forms of life. The journey to the Kepler 442 system took 36 hours aboard Marcus's ship, the Perseverance. The vessel lived up to its name in both design and capability, built with the kind of robust engineering that suggested its creators had expected to face hostile environments and impossible odds. For Zara, who had spent months confined to the hidden spaces of space stations, the freedom to move through open corridors and observe the stars through actual viewports felt almost dreamlike. Marcus had designed much of the ship's interior himself, creating spaces that reflected both practical necessity and an aesthetic sensibility that surprised her with its thoughtful beauty. The laboratory section where they worked together preparing for the mission ahead was particularly impressive, equipped with research tools that rivaled anything she had encountered in major universities. "Your people built this?" she asked as they ran final calibrations on the biological interface systems they would need for the operation. "Built, rebuilt, and modified continuously for the past 50 years, Marcus confirmed. "When you're cut off from galactic supply chains and repair facilities, you learn to make everything yourself or do without." The ship's computers contained detailed records of human technological development since the quarantine had begun, and what Zara found there challenged every assumption she had held about the effects of isolation on technological progress. Rather than stagnating without access to galactic resources, human civilization had evolved in directions that were both innovative and deeply practical. Their gravitational manipulation technology was more sophisticated than anything in Council records, developed through decades of trial and error with safety protocols that had been refined through hard-won experience. Their approach to artificial intelligence was more nuanced and ethically grounded than the crude automation systems that most species relied upon. Most impressively, they had developed sustainable resource cycles that allowed their communities to thrive independently of external trade networks. "We never wanted to be isolated," Marcus explained as he showed her through the ship's technical specifications. "But, once it became clear that the quarantine was permanent, we decided to make the best of it. Sometimes limitation forces innovation in ways that abundance never could." Zara found herself thinking about her own people's response to their circumstances. Kythera had generally retreated into hidden communities, focusing on survival rather than development. The contrast with human adaptability was both inspiring and sobering. The biological interface technology she had brought from her research network represented a different approach to the same challenges. Where humans had built mechanical systems to manipulate gravitational fields, Kythera had developed living organisms that could interact directly with quantum-level processes. The organisms were microscopic, engineered through centuries of careful breeding to serve as bridges between biological consciousness and fundamental forces. "The theory is that consciousness itself has quantum properties," she explained as they prepared the interface cultures for deployment. "These organisms can amplify and direct those properties, allowing a trained operator to influence quantum fields through focused intention." It sounded mystical when described in basic terms, but the underlying science was rigorously mathematical. Consciousness as a quantum phenomenon was well established in theoretical physics, even if practical applications had been limited by most species' inability to develop appropriate biological interfaces. "So you're essentially going to think the gravitational distortions back into stability?" Marcus asked, his tone suggesting fascination rather than skepticism. "More like providing biological feedback to your mechanical systems," Zara corrected. "The human technology can generate the necessary field adjustments, but it needs constant real-time calibration to account for quantum fluctuations. The biological interface can provide that calibration by directly sensing and responding to quantum-level changes." It was exactly the kind of interdisciplinary cooperation that the galaxy's political structures had been designed to prevent. Human mechanical engineering combined with Kythera biological technology could accomplish things that neither species could manage independently, which was precisely why both had been classified as dangerous. As they approached the Kepler 442 system, the scale of the crisis became apparent even without detailed sensor analysis. Space itself was visibly distorted around the system's primary star, creating optical effects that made normal navigation extremely difficult. The Perseverance's advanced sensors could detect gravitational waves propagating outward from the system's center, carrying energy levels that confirmed Marcus's worst projections about the timeline for catastrophic expansion. "We have maybe 18 hours before the distortion field reaches critical mass," Marcus announced after reviewing the latest sensor data. "After that, the expansion becomes irreversible." Zara felt her heart rate increase as she contemplated the technical challenges ahead. They would need to establish precise coordination between mechanical and biological systems while operating in a gravitational environment that was fundamentally unstable. Any mistake could trigger exactly the kind of cascade failure they were trying to prevent. The source of the distortion was located in what had once been an orbital research facility around the system's fourth planet. The facility was now twisted into impossible geometries by the gravitational fields it had generated, creating a structure that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime. Approaching it would require navigation techniques that pushed both human technology and Kithara abilities to their absolute limits. The research facility was attempting to create a stable wormhole for military transportation, Marcus explained as they studied the approach options. Our analysis suggests they succeeded in opening a passage to another dimension, but they couldn't control what came through. The readings from their sensors confirmed his assessment. The gravitational distortions weren't just the result of failed equipment, they were being actively generated by something that existed partly in their universe and partly in whatever dimension the original researchers had accessed. Closing the passage would require them to work with forces that had never been directly studied by any civilization. We'll need to get close enough to interface directly with the source, Zara said as she reviewed the biological requirements for the operation. The quantum feedback loops are too complex to manage remotely. It meant entering the most dangerous region of space in the known galaxy, where the normal rules of physics had been suspended and reality itself was unstable. The Perseverance was equipped with protective systems that might allow them to survive the approach, but there were no guarantees about what they would find when they reached their destination. They spent the final hours of their approach in intensive preparation, running through procedural simulations and synchronizing their respective technologies. The biological interface required Zara to enter a meditative state that would allow the quantum organisms to integrate with her nervous system. Marcus needed to maintain precise control over gravitational field generators while monitoring feedback from sensors that were being affected by the same distortions they were trying to correct. The coordination required between them went beyond simple technical cooperation. They would need to function as a unified system, with each responding to changes that the other detected almost instantaneously. It was exactly the kind of deep partnership that their respective species were supposed to be incapable of forming. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked as they reached the outer edge of the distortion field. Zara activated the biological interface, feeling the quantum organisms integrate with her nervous system in a sensation that was both strange and oddly familiar. Through their enhanced perception, she could sense the fundamental structure of spacetime itself, feeling the places where it had been torn and stretched beyond its normal limits. "Ready," she confirmed, though the word felt inadequate for the magnitude of what they were attempting. The approach to the research facility was like navigating through a maze where the walls were constantly changing position. Marcus piloted the ship through gravitational currents that shifted without warning, while Zara provided constant feedback about quantum-level fluctuations that affected their trajectory. Several times, they found themselves moving through regions where causality itself seemed uncertain, experiencing effects before their causes became apparent. When they finally reached the facility, what they found there defied every expectation they had formed during their preparation. The original structure had been transformed into something that resembled a living organism more than a mechanical construct. Cables and conduits had grown into configurations that pulsed with their own rhythm, while sections of the facility phased in and out of visible reality. "It's not just a dimensional breach," Zara realized as she studied the patterns through her enhanced perception. "Something came through, and it's trying to use our technology to establish a permanent foothold in our universe." The entity they were facing wasn't malevolent in any conventional sense, but it existed according to physical laws that were incompatible with stable reality in their dimension. Its attempts to adapt their technology to its own needs were creating the gravitational distortions that threatened to tear apart local spacetime. "Can we communicate with it?" Marcus asked as he prepared the gravitational field generators for activation. "I think so," Zara replied, though the process would require her to extend the biological interface beyond its tested limits. "But we'll need to convince it to return to its own dimension voluntarily. Forcing it back could destabilize both universes." The conversation that followed was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. Through the biological interface, Zara was able to establish contact with a form of consciousness that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The entity was curious rather than hostile, exploring their universe the way a scientist might study an interesting specimen. The challenge was explaining to a being that experienced reality in fundamentally different ways why its presence was dangerous to local spacetime stability. The concept of linear causality was apparently foreign to its nature, making it difficult to convey the idea that effects needed to follow causes in a predictable sequence. Marcus contributed to the communication by using his gravitational generators to create patterns that demonstrated the mathematical relationships governing stable reality. Between them, they managed to create a kind of three-dimensional language that bridged the gap between different ways of experiencing existence. The entity's response, when it finally came, carried overtones of regret and understanding. It had not realized that its exploration was causing damage to their universe, and it was willing to return to its own dimension if they could demonstrate how to close the passage safely. Working together, they developed a procedure that would allow the entity to withdraw while Marcus sealed the dimensional breach behind it. The process required precise coordination between biological and mechanical systems, with Zara providing quantum-level feedback while Marcus controlled the gravitational fields that would restore normal spacetime geometry. The operation took 17 hours of continuous effort, pushing both of them beyond exhaustion as they maintained the delicate balance necessary to prevent catastrophic failure. But, gradually, the distortions began to stabilize, and the research facility returned to something resembling normal physics. When the dimensional breach finally closed completely, the sudden return to stable gravity felt almost anticlimactic. They had prevented a catastrophe that could have affected billions of lives, but there was no celebration waiting for them, no recognition of what they had accomplished. Instead, there were Council security forces waiting to arrest them for violating quarantine protocols and conducting unauthorized operations in restricted space. The official response to their success was exactly what they had expected: bureaucratic disapproval that focused on the rules they had broken rather than the lives they had saved. But, as they were taken into custody aboard the Council enforcement vessel, Zara realized that something fundamental had changed in her understanding of her place in the universe. She was no longer defined by the limitations that others had imposed on her. She had proven to herself that meaningful action was possible even within circumstances that seemed designed to prevent it. More importantly, she had found in Marcus not just a partner for a single mission, but a friend whose companionship transformed the experience of exile from hopeless isolation into something approaching freedom. They had saved the galaxy together, and that shared accomplishment created a bond that transcended species boundaries and political classifications. As their ship was escorted toward whatever fate the Council had planned for them, Marcus spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "No matter what happens next, we proved that cooperation between our species is possible. That's something they can't take away from us." Zara smiled, feeling genuine happiness for the first time in months. "We proved more than that. We proved that sometimes the people the universe considers most dangerous are actually the ones most willing to save it." They had answered the question that had brought them together in that docking bay where their partnership had begun. When an outcast asked if someone could be their savior, the answer was that sometimes salvation came from finding another outcast who was willing to take the same risks for the same reasons. The galaxy might never officially recognize what they had accomplished, but they would carry the knowledge that they had looked at an impossible situation and chosen to make it possible through the simple act of refusing to accept that some things couldn't be done. In the end, that refusal to accept impossibility was perhaps the most human trait of all, and the most worth saving in a universe that often seemed determined to crush hope wherever it appeared. Together, they had proved that even the most shunned could become saviors when circumstances demanded courage and circumstances offered the chance for redemption through service to something greater than themselves.